Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chin Tan. I'm the Australian Race Discrimination Commissioner. Thank you for joining us today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all joined in this lecture today from the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owners. I acknowledge that we are, where I am anyway, from where I am in Melbourne, on the lands of the Bunurong, Boon Wurrung, and Wurundjeri Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I urge you all, if you haven't already, to learn about the traditional owners of the area you lived in and consider how you can recognize them as well. Secondly, I'd like to thank our generous moderator and speakers, Nedo, Diana, Ahmed, Jason, for sharing the time and stories. Their experiences help us understand how well Australia is traveling through this tumultuous year. I'm eager to listen to each of them and to the discussion that they will share with us. Today's event is the first of three virtual events that will be held in place of the Commission's usual Human Rights Award event. The Commission is very appreciative of our event partner, the EU delegation to Australia, and I welcome Dr. Michael Push, who has obviously made himself available to this session today. And they have been a long time and generous supporter of the Commission and of human rights generally. We're here today to celebrate the anniversary of the Racial Discrimination Act, which was introduced by the Honorable Kept Enderby as the then Attorney General back in 1975. Tomorrow will be 45 years since the Racial Discrimination Act came into effect in Australia as law. It was a landmark piece of legislation. The RDA was Australia's first Commonwealth human rights and anti-discrimination legislation. It heralded Australia's commitment to embracing a multicultural society, one that offered equal opportunities to all Australians, regardless of their race and ethnicity. When he introduced the Racial Discrimination Bill in 1975, Kept Enderby said that there was an educative role for the law. It was about making, and he said, people more aware of the evils of discrimination and the hurtful consequences of discrimination. So this event focused in part on education about the evils of discrimination, and it's the reason why we're here today. COVID-19 has demonstrated the enduring importance of the Racial Discrimination Act and highlighted the right of all Australians to be able to live free from discrimination. That people are feeling afraid in this unprecedented COVID-19 situation is understandable. But the incidence of people turning on their fellow Australians is not just disappointing. It has brought to light underlying prejudice and discrimination. It is unacceptable, and there is no place in our community for racial discrimination and racism. We must draw the line against racism ourselves, in our families, with our friends, our workmates and colleagues, in our associations and clubs, with our community, our associations, our workplaces, in the media and government, and with our leaders, elected officials and parliamentarians. And we must hold ourselves and each other accountable for what we do and do not do in confronting racism and race hate. I hope that you enjoy today's panel, as I certainly will myself. It'll be recorded and made available on our website in the coming days. I also wish to thank members of my team led by Catherine Duff and the Commission for their hard work and dedication in organizing this event. And now I would like to pass to our next speaker, His Excellency Dr. Michael Push. Dr. Push is the European Union Ambassador to Australia. He holds degrees in law and political sciences from the universities of Bonn, Paris, and Cambridge. Before taking up his post in Australia, Dr. Push was EU Ambassador to Singapore. He headed the Russia division in the European External Action Service in Brussels, where he coordinated EU policies on Russia and chaired the EU Inter-Service Group on Russia. He also co-authored the EU's first East Asia policy guidelines. It is now my honor and privilege to invite Dr. Pusch to speak to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chintan, for your kind introduction. The EU delegation has been a proud sponsor of the Racism It Stops With Me award since 2015. And we are delighted to sponsor the Cap Enderby lecture this year. We are honored to join a program named after the Attorney General who introduced the Racial Discrimination Act in the House of Representatives. How fast the world can change. This time last year, we had not heard of coronavirus yet, and nobody could imagine what was in store for us. Our health, our economies, our way of life have all been put under severe strain. Moreover, a further often hidden challenge has emerged. Countries, notably those with dubious human rights records, have used the crisis to roll back civil and social rights. However, also well-established democracies like ours have to combat social and human rights grievances. Coronavirus, and at times response to it, has aggravated structural inequalities, from gaps in social protection to digital divides and unequal access to education. We see more incidences of violence against vulnerable people and minorities, often as a result of disinformation and interference. And it has enabled that monster, that old monster of racial discrimination to raise its head again. We need to fight this development jointly and with a clear message. Our democratic system will not tolerate racial discrimination in any form, whether during a pandemic or at any other time. A crisis like this will test how strongly we are committed to our values. The European Commission was founded, and the Union was founded and built on the respect of human rights. This remains the foundation of our policies, law, and governance. Last month, the European Commission presented its EU Anti-Racism Action Plan for the next 5 years. And in June, Commission President von der Leyen addressed the European Parliament and said this: we need to talk about racism, and we need to act. It is always possible to change direction if there is a will to do so. I'm glad to live in a society that condemns racism, but we should not stop there. The motto of our European Union is united in diversity. Our task is to live up to these words and to fulfill their meaning. In that spirit, I much welcome today's lecture. I look forward to listening and learning from the panelists today. And thank you very much for your attention.
Welcome all to the 2020 Cap Enderby Memorial Lecture. First, my name is Nyadol Nyon. I'll be moderating the session today, and I wanted to thank both Commissioner Chintan and Michael Pusch for their wonderful introductions. Like all the panelists here, I would like to acknowledge the First Nation owners of the lands and waters in which I live and work, and those are the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and their emerging leaders, and commit to learning more about the histories of the oldest civilization on Earth and becoming a better ally. You may notice today that the lecture differs in two ways. First, there is no First Nation person on this panel. This was discussed thoroughly, and we believe because we believe in the voices of First Nation people, and we believe that they should always be given prominence and be heard. We have been assured that this would occur at a different session. Second, you may notice that the structure of the lecture today is different from the traditional form of a lecture usually delivered by a figure, or at least one leading figure, to advance understanding and debate about racism and race relation. We have done far better and brought you three great panelists. The first is Hamed Dini, and then Jason, who has allowed me, so that I don't butcher his name, just say Jason Lee, and Diana Said. I'd like to invite you all and thank you for your time today. I want to give you a bit of a picture about the qualification, indeed the expertise of our panelists. And it's quite broad, so bear with me, and I'll start first with Hamed. Hamed Dini is a prominent leader in the Australian Somali community who became a powerful voice for the residents in the Melbourne Tower who were subject to a hard lockdown in July. As a resident himself in one of those towers, Hamed spoke in media interviews about the impact of the lockdown on community members. Hamed arrived in Australia aged 10 after enduring the challenges life in a Somali refugee camp. As a community advocate, he now supports Somali immigrants to various initiatives. Hamed is the creator of the Australian Somali Football Association, now known as United Through Football. This program promotes sports while mentoring underprivileged young people and building a more cohesive Somali community. Hamed was named in Victoria's Local Hero of 2012, and he continues to empower and create change in the African Australian community. He is passionate about building the next generation of leaders and creating a bright, positive future for African Australia. Hamed is also a board member of the Melbourne Employment Forum. Welcome, Hamed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Then Jason Lee. Jason is the chairman of investment group Vantage Asia and managing director of the China-focused corporate advisory firm Yateson Associates. He became a prominent advocate in the Australian Chinese community, protesting the rise of One Nation in 1999, and has since become a leading voice for the community on issues around inclusion and identity. Jason is the president of the Chinese Australian Forum, a fellow of the University of Sydney Senate, a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, and a member of the Forum's Global Agenda Council on China. He was previously a non-executive director of the George Institute for Global Health, vice chair of the Australian China Chambers of Commerce, a director of the Sydney Institute, and a governing member of the Smith family. He works on road safety in China and won the China Priya Association Silver Medal for Best Campaign in 2005. I'll say, to even sound more Aussie, I'm going to say, welcome, Jace.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And finally, Diana Said, sorry, I got it wrong. I was trying to get it right, is an international human rights lawyer, having worked in both Australia and the US. She's the CEO of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights and has worked in senior roles at Fair Agenda and Amnesty International, where she led the global toxic Twitter campaign, held to hold the social media giant accountable for online abuse that was silencing women. Diana has worked as an advocate and campaigned for over 10 years, including at Human Rights First in Washington, where she challenged the US government on its response to human rights, particularly during the Arab Spring uprising. She has regularly appeared as a media commentator, including on ABC Q&A, The Drum, The World, for SBS, Al Jazeera, and MSNBC. As an Afghan Australian woman from a refugee migrant parents, Diana has lived the experience of being a visible Muslim woman of color in Australia. I'd like to also welcome Diana for joining this panel. Before I go straight into the questions, which I think all of you are here for, I just wanted to give a brief idea about the structure of the session today. The three panelists will take us through the topic of today's lecture, which is racial equality in the time of coronavirus. At the end, We will then invite questions from the audience. I want to start off with a general commentary that most of us would be familiar with. This year, that most of us will remember as the year of COVID, a new term emerged, COVID racism. It has been used to describe what many of us are familiar and know as the old fear of the other. From the racial targeting of Asian Australians, to the hard lockdown imposed on residents in Melbourne Towers, to certain media outlets blaming multicultural communities for the spread of the disease in ways that they do not blame other communities. We have had to ask the question, what has equality and inclusion look like in this year of COVID-19? And I want to start with two general questions directed to all of you here, the panelists. First, COVID-19 has only exposed existing fault line within our society. This is a pattern that I think we've seen repeated across the globe, from disparities in the health outcomes between white, Latinos, and African Americans in the United States, to the support measures that were provided to different groups in Australia while denying others any support at all. For example, the very little support that we also provided to, my apologies, it was bound to happen. Getting back, to the little support that we had seen provided to international students during the first initial response to the impact of COVID-19 on our communities. So my questions to you all are, first, in your view, what were these existing issues that COVID-19 merely highlighted or intensified? And secondly, perhaps starting with you, Hamed, and then Diana, and finally Jason, how have those issues impacted on equality and inclusion in your view?
First of all, thank you, Nyadol, and it's really an opportunity and an honor to be here today. I also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am joining all of you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I think racism is just, it's an amazing word, isn't it? It's just, it just keeps going. It's got a life of its own. You know, you think you've overcome something and then bang, you know, you're just in the middle of something else. But the year of COVID 2020 has actually challenged humanity, to be honest with you. And I think I remember when the outbreak initially happened in China, and students, you know, Chinese students here in Australia, especially, particularly, I believe it was Queensland and Sydney, who were being targeted for a disease that they had no control over. This just does not discriminate. Diseases do not have backgrounds. They do not have ethnic groups. So it was really quite shocking to see those things. But, you know, as an African Australian sitting on the television and watching those kind of things, you know, it just brings some sense of, you know, the world that we live in. You know, the thing is, you know, I always say to a lot of people that I come across, you know, I see an African Australian on television on multiple reasons, right? So either we're criminalized in the terms of, you know, I'm sure you've done an amazing job in that sense of speaking on it, Nyadol, around, you know, the African youth gang myth, to be honest with you, because of I'm a firm believer that they didn't exist. But at the same time, as an African Australian Muslim who's also on the news for, you know, when an incident takes place. But I think the year of COVID has shown the fault lines, and also the pre-existing racism that happens to exist within society. And I think that's, and not only from international students who felt like they were being, you know, we love them to come to this country because they bring in, you know, billions of dollars to our economy. But the fact is, when there was a challenge at the moment when we needed to support them, we basically looked the other way. But not only that, the fact that I live in you know, as you said, you know, I lived in the 9 towers that were locked up. The fact is, we had a much lockdown in Victoria across the state. But then you will think there would be a special recommendation by government or people in the health sector to start working within public housing towers, so they're not forgotten about. But then obviously, because of the second wave, we found out that, you know, even Australians here, you know, like I'm an Australian at the end of the day, and, you know, it seems like Australians are being forgotten about when it comes to racism. And I don't think I'd even want to talk about the Indigenous people in this country. You know, saying we always talk about closing the gap, but we're already creating gaps within multicultural Australia. So the thing is, that's all I wanted to probably touch on, and I'll give the other panelists opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Ahmed, and thanks, Nyadol, as well. It's an honour to be here alongside you all, as well as prominent and outspoken advocates for each of your respective communities. Before I answer the question as well, I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land of which we're all virtually meeting on here today. And I'm here based on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nations. And I also want to acknowledge my own privilege as a settler to this country, who was also forcibly displaced from my own ancestral homes as refugees to this country and living on stolen lands. As a non-Black or First Nations woman of colour. And thank you, Nyadol, for acknowledging that the absence of a First Nations voice. I just want to take a bit of a step back and just say, you know, not just about talk and go straight into the fault lines and what this year has entailed. I just want to say that not only has this year been marred by crisis, as a prominent Palestinian poet and playwright, Sama Sabawi, talked about when I was on a panel with her a couple of months ago. We started this year with bushfires and people, you know, starting 2020 being, you know, having to think about masks and breathing. And then, you know, we went into coronavirus and all of that. That virus entailed sort of attacking of the lungs and our ability to breathe, and sort of pivoted into you know, what we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd. And I actually think that the entire year has been marred by this idea of, I can't breathe, whether it's bushfires, whether it's by a global pandemic, or it's by the very weight of the systems that are on our necks every day, and that we live in a settler colony that weighs so heavily upon us. And I think that minority communities, whether you're Muslim or you're Asian Australian or you're of African descent, or particularly First Nations community, what we saw this week in Victoria, where, you know, the birthing trees in the Jabarang region are being, you know, destroyed. For me, it's really telling that not only have we had fault lines being brought to bear, it's actually, you know, also the inequalities have been brought to light, and the different waves that we've seen of different minority communities that were being targeted. And obviously the media plays a really large role in fomenting fear, but particularly in times of uncertainty, it's heightened, right? So fear as a concept, an idea, is irrational. And I've seen how it's been exploited to blame certain minority communities, and it's really dangerous, and to use that political tool, and it's quite divisive for us as Muslims to see, you know, at different points whenever there's been outbreaks, our communities have been targeted very much so, and I'm sure we'll go into it a bit more. But in terms of your question, Nyadol, around these fault lines for Muslim women, particularly, obviously, you know, we've experienced incredible structural barriers and systemic issues, and, you know, in terms of accessing support services and resources, it was only exacerbated during this period of so much. You know, our communities were already marginalised and isolated, that during this time and transitioning to it, it only brought to bear, you know, that the different touch points with different authorities and government agencies, how digital literacy was a huge gap, financial hardship for families, and women. Obviously, there were different peaks of family violence as well, and different complexities of cases that presented during these periods were really problematic as well. So I'm sure we'll talk more about it, and I've only just touched upon it, but I do have really big concerns about how this has all impacted our access to equality and inclusion, because it's actually become quite divisive, and it's really undermined the very fabric of our society. And even the term multiculturalism is being weaponized against us now. But multicultural for who? We all live on stolen lands of First Nations people. And I think that we always have to come back to that and center those voices and acknowledge that this country is, you know, the land has never been ceded. So I just really want to keep coming back to that point when we discuss what multiculturalism means, equity for who, and, you know, all these inequalities that have been brought to bear. So I'll hand it over to the other panelists.
Thanks, Deanna. I think I'm next. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm beaming to everyone from the lands of the Gadigal people and the Eora Nation here in Sydney. I think where I'd approach this is the reason why Australia became a nation in the first place was at least partly motivated out of fear that the country was going to get overrun by Chinese people. That was the reality, you know, about 120 years ago. And in terms of fault lines, that sentiment has persisted. You know, there has always been an underlying current of discrimination or fear within the broader Australian community that there's so many people up there in Asia. And we're a little island of, you know, 20 million odd people. And what's going to happen when these hundreds of millions of people run out of places to live, and are they going to come and invade us? That fear, that sentiment has persisted, and that is one of the really sort of big fault lines that has been around before COVID. Now, added to that is, I think, the way the United States and its allies have begun to think differently about the People's Republic of China. Ever since about 2018, a couple of years ago, everything changed. Before that time, China was a strategic partner. We worked together on stuff. We really wanted to attract Chinese investment here in Australia. There was all sorts of political engagement. Lots of Australian politicians travelled to China. There was a really big optimism that Australia and China together could do some really wonderful things, and that there was real mutual benefit in this relationship. Then everything changed. And now, or ever since about 2017, 2018, a couple of years ago, China became seen as a strategic competitor, a strategic rival. And China's not without blame in this. The People's Republic of China became more aggressive, more assertive in certain areas. And, you know, there are a number of reasons that cause this, but one of the most challenging things I think we face as a country and as a community now is, how do we deal with this question of trust and loyalty, where you've got about 5% of the Australian population who are of Chinese heritage, but yet there's a superpower, being the People's Republic of China, where people are racially of the same racial group, but where the political system is completely different, and where that country is seen as a strategic competitor, and in some extreme areas of our society seen almost as an enemy. And that is a really difficult thing to deal with, and it's one of the biggest challenges we face as a community moving forward.
Thank you all for those really thorough responses. I want to stay with you, Jason, and sort of pulled out a little bit more of what you've begun to touch on. In the context of COVID-19 around March, we began to see people of Asian background being attacked, being abused, being racially targeted, you know, sometimes when they were on their own. And the ABC did some research and asked readers to share their personal experiences. And many people reported this as their daily experiences of racially charged incidents in supermarket and their place of work and several other places. And a good number of these people were Asian Australians. You sort of touch on the historical underlining theme, the fear that, as sadly Pauline Hanson says, swum by Asians statements. And you've kind of begin to mention some of the modern issues going on about China moving from a strategic ally to more a strategic competitor. In your view, what do you think is happening kind of now, just locally, so the local politics, but also globally, that is impacting the very reaction towards COVID? Because I feel almost sometimes things like COVID can become placeholders for certain issues that people don't know how to directly bring through, and COVID becomes a useful tool of doing so. Could you expand more on some of the stuff that you were beginning to touch on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what's happening right now is it's like a perfect storm at the moment. You've got the underlying sort of racial undercurrents. You've got this strategic competition and this distrust and this fear around the People's Republic of China. And all of a sudden, you've got this pandemic that descends on the community and this narrative that this is a China virus, that China caused it, China brought this to the world, and that it's China's fault. And if you put all those things together, it's dynamite. And that, I think, is what caused, at least at the beginning of the pandemic around March, a lot of the racial abuse directed towards Chinese Australians and Asian Australians. Anyone who looked kind of Chinese kind of copped it, and I felt it myself. And it's awful for a number of reasons. First of all, it's bad. I'm sure, as you know, all of you know, being racially abused is bad in itself, but it's almost more insidious for two reasons. One is it says to people who are getting abused that you're not Australian, that you don't belong here, that you're not part of the Australian identity, that you have no place, you don't really fit in here, and you have no place in this society. So that is tremendously damaging psychologically, socially, culturally, for all of these reasons. What it also does is it creates more distrust. And it creates a question of loyalty. So you guys would have heard about Senator Eric Abetz' questioning to, you know, a few friends of mine at this Senate inquiry, where he framed it as a question, but it was essentially a demand that they unequivocally denounce the CCP dictatorship. Now, these guys are Australian citizens. Why should they need to unequivocally denounce the country of a foreign, the government of a foreign country? It was only because of their racial background. That's the only reason that they were made to do that. But what that does is it really discourages Asian Australians, Chinese Australians from getting involved in the political process. And that's, I think, the most damaging thing about all of this. It disenfranchises people. It silences people. People are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that if they say anything vaguely positive about their heritage or about China, they're going to be labelled a Communist Party sympathiser, a spy, a foreign agent, a traitor to the country. And, you know, speaking to a lot of my friends, they will happily go, I'm happy if people think I'm stupid. I'm happy if people think that I'm completely misinformed or I'm clueless. But if people think that I'm disloyal to Australia when I was born here and I'm a citizen, I can't deal with that. And so people shut up and they don't say anything. And that is a very direct violation of people's human rights, the right to participate equally in the government of your own country. That, I think, is the most damaging and dangerous thing about what's going on now, because it actually destroys our values from the inside. If we're trying to do this stuff, if we are pushing back against authoritarian regimes in defense of our values, but we start distrusting and disenfranchising our citizens, we're actually eating ourselves from the inside.
Wow, that was a very insightful insightful take on it, and you know, we've seen the sort of the ugly side of this public vilification of groups of people. But another way that we've seen, you know, the vilification of other people is through different treatments of similar group, and we saw that in Melbourne, Hamed, when the lockdown of the Towers, which was the harshest, hardest, most severe, you know, measures taken by the Victorian government against, you know, any group of people. And you lived in those towers, and the rest of us watched as this occurred. Could you first of all give us an insight of what it was like to be in the midst of the hardest lockdown in Australia, I think? And then, you know, let's not just leave it there, because I think the community responded in such a powerful way. Could you also tell us how the different response were between the community and government, and which did you think was the most efficient and effective of the two responses?
Well, thank you, Nedo. And I think, yeah, it was for us as residents, people who lived in the towers, when the decision came out, I was watching the ABC. I remember when the Premier made the decision. To me, and a lot of members of the community, it was quite a shock. Like we never, like you said, the harshest and the hardest lockdown in Victoria. But to be honest with you, it was the harshest and the hardest lockdown anywhere in the Western world. The fact that we as Westerners or people who live in a democracy, a very mature democracy, can't can't consult with its citizens in a respectful manner, and to ask them, how do we approach if there is an outbreak in those towers? Ultimately, what we found out was that it was one or two towers that actually had a small, although small but sizable COVID outbreak. Some of those towers had zero, but nonetheless, they went through the same punishment to take away the freedoms of Australians, because the reason I would actually say the reason it happened is the fact that we know, and you'll just have to see on Channel 9 when Pauline Hanson came out and she went along and she said, yes, they should be, put them, lock them away. These people are druggies, they're alcoholics. These are people who generally don't actually take alcohol, or drugs because of religious background or because of the faith they adhere to. But the fact is that the reason we weren't consulted, the reason that we were all punished the same way, is the fact that, as you said, Nyadol, is that we are seen, and to be honest with you, I think everybody knows that, as that we're second-class Australians. If we are actually Australians, we're second class, because this would not happen. This would never have happened if this was in suburbia. It would not have happened if there was towers in the middle of the CBD where people are living. The thing is, and that's one of the things that we asked for. What we asked for from the government was, why wasn't there a process consultation taken at least with the community leaders to ensure that we can actually work through some of the issues within the community? Because we have elders in this community, right? So the thing is, if there's an outbreak, start moving elders out of the towers. There are people who require certain support. There are people who who require interpreters, but that didn't happen. We had 500 police officers basically had a ring of, like, it was a ring. If anyone came to these towers, you would have seen they basically had a ring around us, just basically keeping us from the rest of society. So the thing is, I'm not sure if people have watched the Walking Dead, but I kind of thought that that we were being protected from the rest of society, that we were the problem, when the reality at the end of the day is we were not the problem. And when government and agencies came in, it took a very long time for them to actually, we were told we couldn't leave our buildings, right? So the thing is, then there needs to be some sort of a service in place so that we as residents can basically adhere to the restrictions, but also be comfortable within our own houses. It took 5 days for any letter, for any communication to come into my own household. I can imagine what was happening to other households, right? So the thing is, that's when the community galvanized. That's when African Australians from across Melbourne who didn't live in the towers came in numerous numbers, and also our allies, because I don't want to only just say African Australians, because after that we saw a huge response from Australians from all walks of life. The community response was the one that was received well by the residents, because by the time community first responders started bringing in some of the services that we requested, which some people were requesting medicine support, some people were requesting food, some people were requesting just general support, essential support for their children. It wasn't coming originally from DHS. Because for even to DHS, to be honest with you, they were thrown into the middle of something that I'm sure that they've never went through. So the process was, suddenly we as a community were using the AMSA Center, which I'm sure a lot of people will know about, as a space where a lot of the issues that we were putting through AMSA, and AMSA was able to work with some of the allies that we had on the ground, because we actually even had donations from New York. We had donations from Brussels, you know? We had people from, as far as within Victoria, we had people from the Gippsland region, people from Mildura who were saying, I'm going to drive down, I'm going to bring support for members of the towers. But I think one of the learnings that we've learned was that because the term vulnerable was used so many times to basically put us in a niche, vulnerable community, but the community, people in the residence, and people who people who live outside this community of the African Australian community, actually showed the rest of Australia we're not a vulnerable community. We're a community that's very rich in history. We're a community that has so many rich people in terms of skills. We've got doctors, we've got nurses who suddenly said, you know what, if there's an outbreak, I'm going to put my hand up, I'm going to support my community. But because of the term vulnerable is used on us so many times, from the outsider, it sees that, it makes the concept, and it's a racist connotation, it's a racist narrative, right? Because the thing is it's the concept of the poor black man that always requires the support. Well, no, we're not. We are just like any other Australian. We have our ups, we have our downs, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, we have the capacity to not only support ourselves, but also empower the rest of Australia. But that wasn't taken into consideration, unfortunately.
I think for some of us watching from a distance, the lockdown of the towels demonstrated two things. That, initially at the start, it really shows sort of the gap in which communities have been trying to tell governments for a long time. Decision-making that impacts everybody should involve everybody. And when said, what then happened is that when you don't have that diversity of thoughts and experience in your government structure, when things like this happen, then your response is ad hoc. It is not well prepared to deal with the diversity of the community that it has. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion in the general context, I think this is what we're talking about: preparing systems, preparing governments, preparing institutions to better facilitate their relationship with the individuals that differs in their community. And the second part towards the end of it, and a point that you brought home, Hamed, is the narrative that seems to cage people in these stereotypes, that doesn't allow for an understanding that is nuanced and appreciates the differences that each individual brings. And I think, Jason, also this is come through, and correct me if I'm wrong in your comments, because people see this black and white. They see how you look, and they assume because of how you look that you're not loyal to Australia. They don't see that you might have been one of the Chinese Australian whose parents have been here for hundreds of years, who first arrived here a long time ago before some of this. But they don't see that. They just see who you look like, and they don't have the time to deal with the nuance. And so what happened is that we cage people into stereotypes in order for certain groups of people to feel secure in the identity that they think belong to them. I want to now move to you, Diana. And you already talked about some of these things, and it's really the question of intersectionality and the implications of COVID-19. You already mentioned how COVID-19 impact women and the increase in domestic violence. I don't want to limit you at all, so feel free to answer this question in the way that works for you. And I'll also be interested in your view about First Nations people in this instance. But as a visible Muslim woman of color, I'm very visible. I tend to think I'm too dark, too tall to ever be considered the typical Australian. What are the kind of intersectional issues that you have witnessed during this period that you think haven't really got the attention they deserve, or haven't been addressed sufficiently?
Thanks, Nyadol. And yeah, thank you, Jason and Ahmed, for really highlighting some of the longer term sort of systemic issues that exist in modern day Australian society. And again, for the people at home listening in, I do always want to take a step back and think, 2020 obviously is so unique in a lot of different ways in terms of all the inequalities that have been brought to life. But 2020 cannot be taken in and of itself as a year, obviously people love to bandy about unprecedented times, but for minority communities, everything that's transpired this year, we've actually been saying and talking about this for a really, really long time. Like, if people are now sort of wakening up to the Black Lives Matter movement and systemic and structural systems of oppression and racism in this country, we've been living it for generations. And, you know, we've been warning governments around access and issues and resources, and how our communities have complete agency to self-determine our own lives. And as Ahmed talked about, that narrative around needing to save us because we're so-called vulnerable communities. We're no more or less vulnerable than other people, but we do obviously have systemic issues, whether it's because we've come from, as refugees and migrants to this country with trauma that needs to be addressed, through access to mental health care and, a very specific and sensitive trauma-informed care to mental health in our communities, or whatever it is. But I think that it also comes back to the dehumanization of minority communities as being less than. Somehow we always are talked about through a deficiency lens. And that in and of itself, and that othering narrative and the way that it feeds this dehumanization of our sense of self, also we internalize that too as communities, and we can't help it. And that in and of itself is really harmful as well. But just to Ahmed's point around the hard lockdowns, obviously I can't speak on behalf of anyone who had that lived experience, but as an outsider and as a child of Housing Commission, my family came to Australia forcibly displaced as refugees, much like you, Nyadol and Ahmed. And that was for us was as crucial to have those supports in place for us to then build back a life that was taken, and all the security that was stripped of us and our humanity. It was such a moral affront to see that panning out and playing out, and seeing this heavy-handed policing approach to the pandemic. And, just to see the way that it galvanized communities and all of the exceptional way that the community on the ground and the grassroots organizers just mobilized so incredibly quickly, that it sort of showed that actually it's the communities that need to be empowered to lead the change in their own communities, that we have the tools at hand, we have the expertise, we have all that we need. We just need to be sort of allowed the space to self-determine our own lives. And there are some really harmful sort of white savior narratives. And yeah, we're not in the rooms. We're not being empowered to make decisions. We're not being afforded due process or consulted with. And as a human rights lawyer, being afforded due process is a minimum for our communities, to be given adequate notice to prepare. And so when we talk about intersectionality, obviously I can't speak on behalf of the First Nations communities that were caught up in all of this, but just to see, how the disparate way that people who had disabilities were able to access, healthcare, the children that were locked down, not being able to, and a lot of these families, they have financial hardship as well. So when we talk about everyone pivoting to online resources, actually our communities already have, literacy barriers as is. And then when you talk about digital literacy, well, do these people have devices? Do they have access to those devices? Do they even know how to use those devices? And so very like those sorts of ideas that you have blind spots because you don't understand from your privileged perspective that these people have, a lot of structural barriers to even accessing online supports and resources and services. So that is a starting point. But to talk about experiences of Muslim women during this time, again, it's been obviously varied across the board, and we've been in it now since March. And so we've witnessed different waves and different ebbs and flows of sort of needs-based requests from different Muslim women in the community. Obviously, we are an organisation that's been around for the last 30 years, but we're not a crisis response organisation, but we've sort of pivoted to being that because we've been in this prolonged crisis now for 7 months. And we've just, noticed that a lot of that fear that people have with police and authorities, and feeling frightened and intimidated. If people in, the larger society are fearful of this pandemic, people from our communities are already marginalised and isolated. So their fear is only being heightened by the police and the intimidation tactics that have been used. And even just the way the fines have been issued out to our communities. We've seen yet again, proof that policing our way out of this pandemic disproportionately affects minority communities, with the most amount of fines being issued in lower socioeconomic suburbs and areas like Dandenong and Greater Dandenong region, which we know a lot of minority communities live. So taking that approach, for me, it was really personal and a complete moral affront, and an assault on our human dignity. But I'm not surprised though, because when you chip away at people's sense of self and this idea of the other, and we've completely dehumanized in the media, and I completely feel that the media plays a huge role in feeding that rhetoric and that harmful narrative. Then when governments act, this way, it's not surprising. So I guess in short, because this has turned into a bit of a monologue, but, for Muslim women, obviously they were caught up in the housing lockdowns, but we've just seen them sort of have increased structural barriers, whether it's, in dealing with family violence or child custody matters, not being able to see their children. And as we know, family violence doesn't discriminate. It's in and of itself a shadow pandemic that has touch points with everyone, irrespective of your background as a minority or whoever. We've seen it sort of play out in terms of that narrative around power and control. So women who have had child custody matters haven't been able to go and meet in safe community hubs to transfer over children. And so that's been used and exploited by perpetrators for them to access their children, which feeds in more anxiety and stress for our communities at this time. So it's just, and there's so much there to unpack, and I don't know how much time you guys have to talk about all the different cases of Muslim women and their experiences during this pandemic, but it's just been a really, really tough time for a lot of people, and accessing, services is definitely one of the main ones.
Thank you for that. I want to stay with you onto the next and the last question that will go to all the panelists. And I should mention at this stage that if you've got any questions, we'll be opening it quite soon too. So please send in any of your questions to the Q&A button provided in this session. Generally, all the things that you guys have said have kind of canvassed some of the problems and the issues that existed that are been exacerbated by COVID-19. And COVID has been talked about as a disruptor, a global disruptor of some form, which suggests in itself that there would be a reckoning of how we begin to rebuild back, and whether it's returning to the old systems or re-imagining what our societies and communities can look like. The question that I have is divided in 2 points. What do you think equality and inclusion will realistically look like after the impacts of coronavirus, and what would you ideally hope it will look like? For example, what opportunities do you think this global challenge present that can allow us to sort of build back better?
Yeah, thanks, Nyadol. And, obviously during this stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne over the last few months, it's definitely been a moment to reckon with how we actually dismantle these old ways and systems of working, because who is it benefiting in society? And are these systems of oppression actually where we want to reimagine a world in Australia where, we actually have inclusion and equality for everyone, irrespective of our status as minorities or First Nations, Black, Brown communities, we're all Australians, and whatever that means to you respectively, we have to actually create a society where everyone's voices are heard. And, you know, we all want to self-determine and lead our own lives. So it really is about greater inclusion of our communities, greater accessibility, of course, but also doing that internal work as well around like what spaces are we occupying, and if we're trying to build back better and we pivot to this phase of economic recovery, who is in the room determining and co-designing what those programs look like? If you're in a room talking about communities but no one is present from those communities, you actually shouldn't be discussing anything without them actually not just in the room but empowered to drive those changes for their very own communities. So I really do feel like we need to actually start thinking and disrupting and dismantling and reimagining a better world for our future children. But also that, you know, for minority communities, because when we do speak out, we are so harshly, you know, depicted in the media. And our citizenship as minority communities shouldn't be conditional upon our silence and continued marginalisation. We can't be blamed for our own oppression. When we speak out and speak truth to power, we then shouldn't be the problem. We shouldn't, that's a deflection tactic to sort of distract us from the actual systemic issues. And so that's sort of where I always want to urge people and push people to sort of interrogate their own internal biases that they have when people of colour are actually telling them that, you know, what you're doing is actually harmful behaviour. We're not the problem. We're telling you that everyone is a product of the systems that we live in. And so rather than becoming defensive or telling us that we're the problem because we're vocalizing how, you know, we don't want certain things for our communities because that's not meaningful for us. Actually listen to us and actually center our experiences and consult with us. But beyond consultation and co-design, actually just divest those resources for us to drive that change. And so if you have those means, those people listening, if you're a part of an organization or you're part of that change, you know, divest those resources and allow us to drive that change because we have those solutions. So I also just want to talk about the COVID policing as well, because as Muslim communities, there's already a massive trust deficit. And so the policing narrative also needs to be reviewed, revised, talked about really critically around, you know, what you need to investigate this bias in policing, particularly for minority communities. And obviously as a non-Black, non-First Nations person of colour, I can't speak on behalf of how it disproportionately affects those communities so much more. I just want us to be a bit more interrogatory and like that lens of criticality, like question policies, question government responses. Is this the right way forward for us all collectively? Because, you know, as much as we're in this together, we are, but humans still discriminate, and we have borne the brunt of this for way too long. And really, at the end of the day, we are not the problem. So I just want to highlight that again and say thank you for the time. And yeah, if I can leave you with that, just people just to be critical of policies.
We'll have you next, Hamidini. I'll just repeat the questions, which is, what do you think realistically the future will look like, and what would you ideally hope it would look like?
Yeah, well, thank you, Nido, and thank you, Diana. I think I agree with a lot of things that you just mentioned there, but I'm an optimistic individual, actually. So when I look into the future, I like to look at through the scopes of, you know, positivity. So but at the same time, I won't lie to myself, Nido. This country has had issues with one skin color, and that's the Black skin color. And I think, you know, I've been in so many panels, I've had so many discussions about how different migrations in Australia or people of you know, refugee bands from multiple countries from overseas went through and were subjected to racism. But when it comes to the African Australian community, I think it's been perpetuated for far too longer. And the critique around African Australian or the Black color is just a bit harsher. And I've told a lot of people, like a lot of my friends, I always tell them, like when I'm in the back of the tram, I'm very visible. right? You know, I'm a black man, you know, like, and I've had people who said, you know, the Greeks and Italians, you know, and I know that, and they've went through a lot of racism when they first came to this country. But there's an aspect of me until the First Nation Australians get empowered in this country, until there's this recognition of the indigenous people of this country or a treaty, I'm always going to be relegated as a black man or as a black person. Because the thing is, my color has an issue with this country because it's never been dealt with. As Australians, we've never sat down around, you know, on the table with indigenous people who happen to be black, just like I am, and we've never come to a consensus. So in saying that, I also want to dissect and probably take down a word that's so much often used when it comes to dealing with our communities, and that's the word of empowerment. The word of empowerment, the way it's used today, and it's been used for the last 20 years when it comes to communities, you know, multicultural communities, cold communities, is being where an outsider comes in and tries to empower you through capacity building projects and stuff like that. But then after 20 years, you find yourself in a far worse situation than when they first walked in. And then that's one I already said about the word vulnerable, because they can't the word vulnerable. Because the thing is, as long as you're helping Ahmed and the rest of his peers for as long as forever, then obviously your resources don't dry up. So the thing for me is the word empowerment doesn't mean the way that we use it today, either in service provision, in government agencies, or just in government, generally within government. The word empowered means I have self-determination. I know my community, or we know our community better than anyone else. One of the things that I find very interesting, and I'm sometimes quite frustrated, to be honest with you, because we're the community that's been consulted to death, is someone comes in, gets a bit of a pot of funding from government, and they're like, "Oh, Ahmed, tell us, what does the community need?" I'm like, "I've already spoken about this for 1,000,000 times. I don't want to speak about it again." But the truth of the fact is, imagine if that process, if there's a due process, and that resources was allocated to people who are from the community, who know the problems, who don't need to spend 1 year trying to find out what the problems are. And by the time the funding is finished, they're like, "Oh, sorry, the funding's finished. We haven't actually started doing any work in the process yet." So for me, to be honest with you, Neodol, I think I'm hopeful. I think the status quo needs to go. I think everyone needs to be seen as an Australian who's capable, has the capacity to not only empower themselves as individuals, but to empower their own communities. When we see certain aspects of community as, to be honest with you, one of the things that one of my friends said to me during the hard lockdown is like, "Ahmed, are we actually in a refugee camp in Melbourne? Like the most livable city in the world, just set up a refugee camp." And that is the reason why the hard lockdown happened in the 9 Towers, is because of policies and procedures that were put in place to always help these people without truly wanting them to help themselves. We're a very mature people now. And I think, some of the conversation I'm having with some of my younger friends is within the African Australian communities. We've been in this country for quite a while now. For 30 years, heading to 40 years, the African Australian community is very mature. And we will no longer sit back now and allow outsiders to come in and tell us how to live or how to empower ourselves. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, to you, Jason. And I'll repeat those questions, but I wanted to add a little bit of a twist to it, which is what do you think realistically things will look like? Because I think people are already thinking about how it's going to be a much more fair, equitable society. And what would you ideally hope that it will look like? But I want to sort of tie it to a final issue, if you can comment on it too, is, in this future that we can imagine, how do you think we should structure this idea of who is Australian?
It's a great question. I'm going to just try to keep this short. I think in reality we're a pretty fractured society and really fractured world right now, and it really worries me. Remember around January, February, just the image of the mask. I remember Diana was talking about, I can't breathe. There's this image of the mask back then, if you remember it. Here in Australia, we had bushfires and everybody was wearing the masks, the N92 masks because of the bushfires, because they couldn't breathe. In China, everybody was wearing the masks because of COVID-19, because it had already gotten out of control there. And in Hong Kong, all the demonstrators were wearing masks because they wanted to hide their faces from the police so that they couldn't be identified. And so all different situations, but all signs of trouble, a really troubled world, climate change, bushfires, authoritarian action, pandemic. What can we do about it? I think there's a few things, and I'll weave in your third question to this answer. I think we need to broaden out and make much more inclusive and much more reflective of the modern Australian community what it means to be Australian. And I think a really big part of that are the stories and the myths that we tell. If we think of our national stories and our national myths, it's about the Anzacs, it's about Phar Lap, it's about Don Bradman, it's about surfies at the beach. And it's not to say that these things should not be celebrated or should be denigrated, but they're not necessarily fully reflective of who the Australian community is now. And I picked up for my daughters Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls a while ago. And I thought that was just the most wonderful thing. And so one of the things that we're working on now is how do we create a children's book that tells stories of amazing Australians from all backgrounds, that recognises the role of women, that recognises the role of migrants and minorities, that recognises the pivotal role, the central role of First Nations people, so that we broaden out the stories and the mythology that define who we are as Australians and the values that we celebrate and who belongs and who doesn't. And I think that that's a really practical and powerful way to retell our national stories. That's number one. Number two is kind of what you guys are doing already on the panel. We need more people from diverse backgrounds in leadership, whether it's parliamentary leadership or all aspects of leadership. And so I hope that Australia can really push this debate. This diversity debate needs to begin encompassing racial and cultural diversity as it continues to fight for gender equality. I think that that debate needs to be powerfully progressed. The third thing that I'd say is I think we need to put the emphasis back on the multi. And what I mean by the multi is if we think of how the world and Australia responded to the pandemic, I think the multi kind of went out the window and it all went to uni, right? We rather than using multilateral institutions, all the borders came up and we started stockpiling PPE and masks and everybody retreated. And even within countries here in Australia, we didn't treat it as one country, we retreated into state borders. So we all retreated into ourselves. And it's like the multi in multilateralism, in multiculturalism, all of that went out the window. One thing that I hope that we can do at the end of this pandemic is that we reassert the power and the importance of working together and working as one country, but also working as a global community to address the really big issues that confront us as human beings that can really only be tackled with all countries and all people working together, such as global pandemics, such as climate change, such as the eradication of poverty, such as all of these issues. So my hope is if we reflect after the pandemic, we can begin to think again about the power of working together.
I think that's a really wonderful note to now move to the questions by the panelists. I'm going to start by addressing just a concern that someone has raised, saying that they don't understand why there is no First Nation voices on this panel. As I mentioned before, we had this discussion with the Commission and we were told that there are several other public events that are scheduled, including the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, June Oscar, who will be launching his finding from the Winyani Youth Sangani, which is Women's Voices Project. I'm sure I've completely butchered that as a proper Aussie. And so if you are interested in finding out more, I'm sure the people who organize this forum will definitely be able to provide you and direct you to those events that will prioritize Indigenous Indigenous voices. But that's absolutely something we accept and do not shy away from, that Indigenous voices should always be given prominence above the voices of others as the First Nations people. We've got until about 1:30 for questions and answers. I've got a few questions here on my phone, so if I start looking down, it is not because I'm trying to keep up with Facebook and Twitter. So I'm going to read one of the first questions, and any of you, the panelists, is happy to, can take it up. The question is, would you agree that it's about having cultural engagement and consultation to better understand the diversity and cultural impacts and implications? I assume this is the cultural impacts and implications of COVID-19. I might read another question, and then you can have a pick, each of you, what each of you might answer. This is one I find really interesting. What are your thoughts on multiculturalism in the times of Black Lives Matters and First Nations? So perhaps we could start with you, Diana, and you could pick which question you would prefer. And if she answers one, I'll expect the other panelists to answer the other.
Okay, well, I probably will opt for the second question because we've already talked about extensively about consultation and how it's actually leadership and driving and self-determining our own lives. But I do really feel that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to bear sort of a culmination of everything that is structurally and systemically based on the systems here in Australia and the very systems of oppression where it fuels fear and othering, and it's a moment of reckoning for all of us when we think about reimagining our future. And obviously, as a non-Black, non-First Nations person of colour, I can't really speak too much on it, but I can say that I have seen a lot of what I call like white people actually, trying to do some of that work and the unlearning and the decolonizing that is required, and having sort of those uncomfortable conversations and trying to interrogate some of their own implicit biases that they have. And look, people of colour and even Muslim communities are susceptible to anti-Blackness. It's a reality. Look, we are also products of the systems that we live in, and we can't deny that. We're not immune from media inputs. We're not immune from headlines and, the demonizing of whether it's First Nations or Black people in this country, and those really prejudicial stereotypes that are fed to us on repeat. It's a conditioning that we all have to collectively unlearn, because it's something that we are not going to progress. And I say this a lot in my work at our centre, that for us to even start tackling issues around Islamophobia, if we haven't reckoned with the true history and the ongoing impacts of colonisation in this country and centre First Nations voices in, we are not going to see progress on issues of discrimination, whether racial discrimination or Islamophobia or whatever it is, because we are not engaging in truth telling. We're not actually centering what First Nations people want. And for us to do that, I think that's where, it's a valid point that we don't have a First Nations person on this panel, and we've all brought it up collectively. And it's for us to keep pushing that dial, keep asking the questions, keep asking for inclusive voices and centering of those experiences, because we're not going to see progress on anything else until we've reckoned with that. So I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement definitely galvanized, and someone who attended the protests, it was really awe-inspiring to see how many people showed up. But it shouldn't have to happen in the US for people to reckon with what's happening in Australia. People can rattle off George Floyd's name and Breonna Taylor, but if you ask them about Aboriginal deaths in custody and whether they can name people here in Australia, people don't make that connection. And so that's the narrative that's completely being erased. And that also comes back to education in schools and reckoning with our history and the true history. We've got Black convicts that came here, as Jason talks about. There's Afghan cameleers in our history. I'm not a surfer. I don't surf. I am, my history is still only very relatively new, but there are Afghan Cameleers that came here as well back in the 1800s, and same with the Asian Australians as well. But that's been completely erased and whitewashed. So I do feel like that's a really big, it's a problem, but it's also an opportunity. So I'll take what Ahmed has talked about being positive. I think this is a moment for change and reimagining a better future for us all.
Ahmed, the first question, which I'll pose to both you and Jason, the first question was, would you agree that it's about having cultural engagement and consultation to better understand diversity and cultural impacts and implications? I want to combine that with another question, because I think that draws out the specific of the first question, which is, you know, in the towers when the lockdowns were occurring, what better experiences, what would better experiences look like for the residents of those of those towers, either from community health agencies that or people who attended? What could have been done that would have made for a better experience? And then I want to move to you, Jason, in a similar way of trying to specify that question. What would better experiences look like in terms of how we move ahead as Australians? For example, how could we better our politics and the way we talk, you know, the question of asking for loyalties and that? What do you think needs to happen within our politics and media so that, you know, there are better experiences for Asian Australians? So starting with you, Hamid.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nedo. And I think the concept of cultural awareness or cultural appropriate is a word that's always often used. But then sometimes when you come across what just took place in the towers, you realize that went out of the window when the decisions were being made on the ground, right? So, but the thing is that I wouldn't actually dwell a lot on this, but what I'll say is one thing that we saw and every Australian saw and cannot deny is the fact that people from across all walks of life who were basically led by the African Australian community showed DHHS, government, of how to basically interact with members who were locked up, the 3,000 people who were locked up in those towers. And when the reason that happened is because it's so easy for someone to say, I understand the people in this, in these buildings. I know their faith, or I know the experiences they went through. I've lived those kind of experiences. But one of the things that we've had earlier on is we had non-halal food coming in the towers, which has a huge, within the 3,000 residents, probably a half or just more than a half were Muslim, but you had food that was non-halal food. And these decisions or mistakes were being made by government agencies. So cultural understanding in itself doesn't mean, I've heard about the cultural beliefs or narratives of this community. It's rather saying, why don't we have people who actually understand the culture, the faith-based of these communities actually lead the response? That's not what happened, but the community were able to do that themselves. So in terms of speaking in terms of the idea of what is cultural appropriateness or cultural awareness, one of the things that I like to say is cultural understanding. That's the most important thing. Because the thing is to say cultural appropriateness, what is cultural appropriateness? Because then you say, okay, it's appropriate for a Muslim to have a halal food. But if you have a cultural understanding, then you actually have a better outlook of the people that you're trying to work with and the people that you're trying to empower or try to support. But the thing is, I don't like the idea of always saying people you like to support, because in Australia, in a Western country, we shouldn't be having the discussion of, I don't know anything about the South Sudanese community or the Somali community. How do I? Actually, there should be someone within your workplace who comes from those communities, who can give you first-hand experience, say, no, I know them. You know what? I'm more than happy to engage with them. So that's all I want to finish there.
You, Jason? You are not. You've.
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. I'm going to try to keep this short again. I agree with everything that Ahmed and Diana had said about having people who actually understand their own cultures find solutions and involve them in the decision making. I think for Asian Australians and China, well, not just Asian Australians and Chinese Australians, I made this point before. It's so important that our politics and our government begin to reflect more about what our population look like. We are so behind places like Canada, the United Kingdom, even the United States in terms of the diversity of our parliament. So I hope a lot of really talented sort of young people like you guys stand for office and are elected to office. And so the political leadership of our country begins to look a lot more like you guys, and it's super important. The other thing that I would say is, and I'm going to go back to this notion of trust, that we need to be able to trust Chinese Australians and people who have migrated to Australia, even when their home countries might be regarded as unfriendly towards Australia. Because, well, first of all, if we don't do that, if we start distrusting our own citizens, that leads us down a really dark path. That's the first thing to say. Second thing to say is it actually is counterproductive if we distrust them, because if we think, this is in the context of what a lot of people think is an ideological battle between Australian values and those of authoritarian states, such as, you know, the PRC or the CCP. If a migrant has come to Australia and they have chosen to live here and they've chosen to be Australian, if we don't fully include them in the life of the country, if they don't see that people who look like them or have their background can attain leadership positions or be in the government of the country, if they don't feel fully Australian, what that does is that it actually drives them in the other direction. It actually makes the charms of the CCP more attractive. And so, almost paradoxically, if we want to counter foreign interference and foreign influence, we need to make Australians who come from those places and come from those cultures feel like they completely belong here. And that's the way, that's the most effective way that we stand up for our values. The same thing goes for international students as well. If we're racist towards international students, they're going to go home and think, Australian values aren't all they cracked up to be. But if we embrace international students and treat them and show them all the wonderful things that Australia has to offer, they may well be convinced that our way of life has a lot of advantages, and most will go home to their countries and will sing the praises of Australia. So I think this notion of trust and loyalty, that's the best way to handle it.
Thank you for that. And that notion of trust and loyalty is something that I think all of us really have to reckon with at a personal level as well. And as you know, as citizens, I often ask myself when I hear these questions about Sudanese Australians and African Australians, and the way the media and even some politician and another talks about them, I almost ask myself, who are they talking about? Because they're not the people you meet. You know, I know young Sudanese women who their goal is not to get necessarily married, you know, at 16 or something. It's to travel the world. They are as much a combination of being in this country and loving this country and being transformed by this country that they are, you know, their country of origin. And so that notion of trust, replacing, you know, some of the fear with trust, it would be useful, because the fear that somehow I'm either going to always be where my parents came from or when I landed, as if nothing happens in your journey and your history. I'm sure for your daughter and my kids, they are very different even from us. They're different kind of Australians. And it's a shame that we're not having sufficient representation, but also sufficient storytelling to make us comfortable in the idea that this is not a strange thing, that multiculturalism is not something that just has to conceptually exist, but practically has usefulness in terms of whether it's economic, but also in the diversity and the richness of our culture and our identity. Last question, because we are almost getting to the end of it. We've got just five more minutes. I'm going to ask you guys to really answer really quickly. The question is, what would you wish to see more of from majority individual to level up the playing field. I understand it to be, what would you like to see individual to do? We've talked about institutional failures and institutional responses. What can individual do? Really, really quickly, each of you. Hamid?
I thought Diana was about to jump in, but very individually, I think, you know, it's about, as you said, I think one thing you just mentioned quickly, at the end was storytelling. If you're an individual who is working in a space, I think the best thing to do is sometimes just go out of your way, start listening to groups, people who are different to you, diverse, and it's not, and that's both ways, to be honest with you. You know, as an African Australian, I'm happy and go and have discussions and see the conversations that I said that's happening in Australia, you know, the Asia, you know, communities within the Asian community in Australia, the Muslim community, the Arab communities, the Afghani communities. But at the same time, you know, it's, and also in a wider Australian context of, you know, Anglo concept of what it means to live together. I think one of the things that we haven't done well as a nation, to be honest with you, and that's why we still find the issue with Indigenous people, is we do not very well at listening to other people's stories. You know, because the thing is, Australia had the opportunity to listen to the stories of Indigenous people for over 200 years, but we have neglected that. And what's happening in the multicultural sector right now, one of the things that Jason quite touched on before, is the fact that we dismiss people. You know, we're dismissing people, you know, we're belittling them, and then certain things become very attractive, right? So, there's an alternative always for members of the multicultural community. So the idea is to listen to them, to listen to their stories, because at the end of the day, we all have one thing in common, and I think Diana touched on this: the fact that, you know, we all came from the seas. You know, it's an Australian thing, that we all have come across the seas to try to make a better life for ourselves, and that's not happening currently right now, to be honest with you, because of, you know, one of the things I wanted to mention earlier that I didn't mention, that I quickly want to probably finish off, is that pre-COVID we had 50% unemployment in the 9 towers. Now in COVID, the numbers are in the high 70s. So that itself, to be honest with you, because there's so many different things that, you know, perpetuates the system of, of inequality in this country, is the fact that people are not even given the basic necessities to actually succeed and thrive in society. And that is the fact that people should have a job. It's a human right thing. So I'm going to finish off by saying, let's listen to one another. Let's give each other the opportunity, and let's all be positive, to be honest with you, because I think positivity is the way forward. So thank you.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Ahmed. And I really admire your positivity, particularly given, you know, your lived experience of being in the hard lockdowns. And I'm actually going to take on a lot of that, because it's hard not to, and coming back to my analogy that I start with, feel the weight of the entire system on you, and, you know, sort of constricting your ability to breathe every day, particularly as we're coming out on the other end of this pandemic. And just trying to shoulder that together as minority communities, that we are in this together, actually. Like, all of us collectively have a responsibility to start dismantling the systems that don't work for all of us collectively, whether it's disabilities or First Nations or whoever has, you know, and that's when we talk about intersectionality. But I do also want to caution, and this is where sort of nuance and a little bit of complexity comes in, around having to always prove our humanity through storytelling. We are, at a base level, all human beings with certain rights and responsibilities as citizens of this nation, whether we came here in the First Fleet or we've come through different migration pathways. And that the notion of us listening and centering First Nations experiences and their history, I think, is the first and foremost. If we want to see change, if we want to see real progress in this country, and we want to advance the rights of everyone, we have to reckon with our past. We have to be honest with ourselves about the truth-telling and the true history of this country. And that's when we can honestly tackle any other forms of discrimination that other minority groups will continue to experience going forward. Until that happens, it's just not going to happen. So I'm conscious of time, but thank you so much for having me as well today.
I don't have much more to add to any of that. I think that was really well said. Maybe the only thing is the hope that all of us in all of our interactions, focus on the rebuilding of trust. As I think there is such a trust deficit across all areas of our society and our world at the moment. It's a really big problem. So I hope that all of us can focus on rebuilding trust where we can.
Well, that marks the end of it. Very good final comments. We have now reached the end of this session. I would like to first thank all of you. You've kind of hanged around. There's still about 200 people logged on, so I want to thank you all for your participation. Then, of course, I want to thank the panelists, Anna, Jason, and Hamed, for participating and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And a personal thanks to the Human Rights Commission for inviting me to moderate this session, and to the European Union delegation to Australia for sponsoring this 2020 CAB Edeby Memorial Lecture. This legislation, the Racial Discrimination Act, was enacted and came in force 45 years ago. It is now approaching half a century, yet I think all of us know that the work to advance public understanding and debate about racism and race relation remain ever alive today and will continue to do so. COVID-19 has only shown and exposed how much more work lies ahead. Thank you all then for your involvement today, the participants, those who organize it, the panelists, for doing your part, I think, in advancing that work that began before 1975 and which will continue today and tomorrow. Thank you so much all for your attendance and for allowing me to moderate this. It's been a total pleasure.